we have to ask ourselves what it is that's going on here. My late father was a United States Air Force officer for 32 years. He spent a dozen years after that working for the Lockheed Corporation in the Middle East. You start getting into my father's resume, you discover that he had more than a passing acquaintance with the American Central Intelligence Agency for quite a number of years. My father, at one point in his career, after he left the American military, was a chief of Air Force logistics for Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi's Imperial Iranian Air Force for 5 years before the Islamic Revolution. My father changed hats after that revolution, went to Saudi Arabia, became a director of logistics for the Royal Saudi Air Force for 5 years before he fully retired. That is the type of profile and the type of family background that I have. I am not being honest with you if I don't tell you that. Just as I told the people at Al Ansar Center that the other day in Durban, South Africa. I want you to understand who I've been and where I've been and what has shaped and influenced my life when I tell you now at the age of 57 that the world looks a lot different to me than it did at the age of 20, or than it did at the age of 25 when Ronald Reagan was first elected President of the United States and I was in a Christian seminary in Chicago. I actually believed at that time that America was turning the corner and becoming a better place because Ronald Reagan had been elected President of the United States. And now, 32 years going on, the United States is not a better place, but it's far worse. All of you have read, I'm sure, about a $16 or $17 trillion national debt. You've all read about an unfunded liability in Social Security and Medicare of $222 trillion. You've read about the Federal Reserve Board and the printing of fiat money. You've read about the power and ownership of our elections and our news media by Zionist interests and multinational corporate interests. You've seen with your own eyes, as you've been in this country, many of you for some years now, that we are a more decadent society, a more immoral society, a more violent society than we've ever been. This is no longer the America of my parents and grandparents. This is an America that I don't recognize from when I was young. And from the time that John Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas on November the 22nd, 1963, all these 49 years later, I'm no longer an 8-year-old kid in a public school in Montgomery, Alabama, while my father was at the Air War College at Maxwell Air Force Base. I'm a 57-year-old man who somehow, some way, by God's grace, has come to understand more than I wish I knew and understood about who and what it is that was behind that killing. Who and what it is that has been beyond and behind the progressive declension in American morals and spiritual standards. Who and what it is that has destroyed the economy of this country for the average American. Who and what it is that controls the American news media and the American mind and is warping thousands upon thousands upon thousands of millions of American minds to support something that isn't in their interest, it isn't in your interest, and it isn't in my interest. And that's a war between the United States and Israel on the one hand and Iran on the other. Or a great neoconservative Zionist vision for a war of civilizations that will pit the remaining Christian population of the West, however small that has shrunk to, in fact, and the Islamic world. And so we ask ourselves, who wins? Who loses? Who really benefits by these policies? You know, and I know, as devout Muslim and Christian people, who can still think by God's grace, the American news media and the American educational process and Hollywood notwithstanding, who are still able to think and to analyze and to process information and to come to seminars like this one. We understand that Americans who represent my demographics and who still have a mind and who still have a soul, and Islamic peoples who are peacefully living in the United States and who, the Zionist lobby notwithstanding, do not truly threaten the United States or the coexistence of Christian peoples and Islamic peoples together, we have it figured out. We've got a mutual enemy. We have a mutual adversary. Your spiritual lives, your theology, your families, your communities, your livelihoods, your personhoods are being threatened by the same thing that threatens me, and that has destroyed the America that my grandparents and great-grandparents knew when they came here from Germany, that my parents knew as young people growing up in the American Midwest at the time of the Great Depression of the 1930s. From the time of the Second World War and the great fraud that was perpetrated on the American public by Franklin Delano Roosevelt and a false flag operation known as the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor that galvanized an entire American citizenry to support something that looked one way and that they thought was a great and righteous cause that had completely unintended consequences because they really didn't understand the forces that were behind it, became a generation later the assassination of John and Robert Kennedy. Became a generation later Israel's attack on the USS Liberty on June the 8th, 1967, and the systematic withholding of information from the American public as to how all of that happened. We became the America of the Pollard spy case and the IPAC spy cases. We became the America of 9/11, so that I, the great white Republican Christian hope of years ago, could be before Islamic radio audiences in South Africa and could be invited to speak live at the Al-Ansar Center to hundreds of Islamic peoples of Sunni persuasion who had heard me on the radio and wanted to know more. All of a sudden, I'm telling them, as someone who is still a Christian, who still loves America, even though I'm sickened by what we've become, and I am sickened by what has co-opted our country. I am sickened by it. And as one who is an ex-Republican, and as one who came from an American military family, where my father now rests in Arlington National Cemetery in Washington, D.C., in Section 54, Grave 4028, virtually at the foot of where John Kennedy is buried, I'm telling them there's something wrong with this 9/11. There's something wrong with what really happened to John Kennedy. And all of a sudden, I'm looking at all of American history, as well as the history of at least the last 2,000 years, if not longer, and I'm beginning to understand how this game is played. Beginning to understand how this game works. Beginning to understand the power of the international bankers and the power of the multinational corporate news media that they own, the power of the governments of the Western world in particular, and the United States government specifically, that they've been able to purchase. If you don't believe that, Sheldon Adelson, the Zionist Jew, right, who owns the Sands Casino in Las Vegas, he was more than happy to pump $100 million of his petty cash. That meant to him about what it meant to me paying a couple of tolls out here on the Sam Houston Tollway to get here to this engagement, right? To influence, to purchase, to own American elections and all that's implied by it. And now we stand at the threshold of a third world war. A war that's going to destroy the lives of thousands upon millions of people unless God intervenes in his providential wisdom and gets it stopped, chooses to stop it. A war that will destroy untold numbers of lives and families of people that believe they're doing the right and godly thing by supporting it and getting their kids to sign up for it, and who will believe all of the propaganda in the American media, on television, purchased and otherwise, that will underscore that this is supposed to be some great moral, righteous crusade. How can you have a great and moral crusade in a country which supports abortion on demand, homosexual marriage, and the type of perversion and violence and evil that you can go right down here to the Shell station and see what's on that magazine rack when you're walking in there to buy a bottle of water, or when you see the sewage that is routinely being conveyed to the minds of people in this country when they're watching television, or when they go to 98% of our movies, or when they're watching political advertisements that feature Benjamin Netanyahu right in the state of Florida trying to convince people that the election of one of these two guys is some great moral crusade. This is the state to which we have fallen. This is the stage to which we have come. And so whether you've got my demographics or yours, the fact of the matter is we have a mutual enemy, a mutual adversary, and we are living at a very dangerous time in history. How dangerous is it? A handful of years ago, there was a news leak of something going on in the state of Missouri that indicated that the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith had convinced our so-called post-9/11 Homeland Security Department that the greatest threat to American society, representing the biggest and most significant generalized terrorist profile, was, curiously enough, not Islamic peoples, not Arabs, not Persians, not Palestinians, but guys that look and sound a lot like Mark Glenn and Mark Dankof. White guys who go to church, who don't favor gay marriage and support the pro-life position on abortion, and legally own firearms, and are trying to warn people about Zionist New World Order influence. We, according to this profile that emerged from Missouri state law enforcement, courtesy of both our federal Homeland Security Department and the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, guys that sound and look like Mark Dankof and Mark Glenn and Michael Collins Piper of the American Free Press, we're now the bad guys. Really? I thought we were out of the tradition of Thomas Jefferson and H.L. Mencken and Harry Elmer Barnes, right? And people like that. We are, in the best sense of the word, patriotic Americans. We're American nationalists. We happen to be Christians of different persuasions. But all of a sudden, according to what has taken over this country, we are perceived as being as much an enemy of this society as that society's news media is saying about each and every one of you who is gathered here. And this is why Mark Glenn and Hisham Talawi envisioned this Crescent and Cross Foundation some years ago to build a bridge between the Islamic and truly Christian communities in this country and around the world, so that we might work together and understand one another better, understand the mutual threat that is posed to each of our communities by what's going on, and might be in a better position to defend ourselves.